April 18th, 1942, 12:30 p.m. Tokyo time. American B-25 bombers roar over the Imperial Palace at treetop level. For the first time since the Mongol invasions, enemy bombs explode on Japanese soil. The impossible has happened. 16 medium bombers have launched from an aircraft carrier 600 miles at sea, something every aviation expert said couldn't be done. Japan's military leadership stares in shock at the burning buildings across Tokyo. 6 months earlier, Japanese forces controlled an empire spanning over 3 million square miles. From the frozen Aleutians to the tropical Solomon Islands, the rising sun flag flew over conquered territory stretching halfway across the Pacific. Britain's mighty Singapore had fallen. America's Philippines were lost. Australia trembled under the shadow of invasion. But between April and June 1942, everything changed. You're about to discover how Jimmy Doolittle's impossible raid on Tokyo triggered a chain of events that transformed the Pacific War. How American codebreakers gave Admiral Nimitz the ultimate advantage. And how a devastating series of dive bomber strikes at Midway destroyed Japan's carrier supremacy in a single morning. This is the story of America's awakening, when a wounded nation rose from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to deliver the most decisive naval victory in modern history. By April 1942, the Japanese Empire had achieved what no Asian power had ever accomplished. In just 4 months of warfare, Emperor Hirohito's forces had shattered the colonial empires that European powers had built over 3 centuries. The statistics were staggering. Japanese troops occupied Malaya, Thailand, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and most of the precious Philippines. In the Pacific, the rising sun flag flew over Wake Island, Guam, the Gilbert Islands, and New Britain. From the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia to the oil fields of Borneo, Japan now controlled the resources that had once fueled Western industrial might. But it was the speed of conquest that truly shocked the world. Hong Kong, Britain's gateway to China, had fallen in just 18 days. The Dutch East Indies, with its vast oil reserves, surrendered after barely 3 months of fighting. American forces in the Philippines found themselves trapped and surrounded before they could mount any meaningful defense. The crown jewel of Japanese conquest was Singapore. For over a century, this island fortress had been the cornerstone of British power in Asia. Churchill himself had called it the Gibraltar of the East, a stronghold defended by massive coastal guns facing seaward and protected by Royal Navy forces. General Tomoyuki Yamashita had other plans. The man who would earn the nickname Tiger of Malaya launched his invasion not from the sea, where Singapore's guns waited, but from the jungle-covered Malay Peninsula to the north. Using bicycles and light tanks, his forces raced down roads the British thought impassable, outflanking every defensive position. On February 15th, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival walked into Singapore's Ford factory to surrender. With him went 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops, marking one of the largest military capitulations in British history. As Yamashita accepted the surrender, Japanese photographers captured the moment that would shatter British prestige across Asia forever. The psychological impact rippled across the colonial world. If mighty Britain could not defend Singapore, what hope did any Western power have in Asia? Japanese propaganda broadcasts proclaimed a new era, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, where Asian peoples would be freed from the shackles of white colonial rule. For many Japanese soldiers, the string of victories created a dangerous sense of invincibility. In the officers' clubs of Manila and the barracks of Batavia, toasts were raised to the emperor's divine protection. Western forces, it seemed, simply could not match the fighting spirit of the imperial army. This confidence bred complacency. In some newly conquered territories, Japanese units actually stood down from full alert. Officers who had driven their men relentlessly through the jungle campaigns now allowed rest periods and recreational activities. Why maintain wartime intensity when the enemy appeared so thoroughly beaten? But for the hundreds of thousands caught behind Japanese lines, the reality was far different from the propaganda promises. In Singapore's Changi prison, British and Australian POWs found themselves crammed into facilities designed for a few hundred prisoners. Food rations were deliberately kept below starvation levels, rice gruel twice daily, sometimes with a few vegetables if the guards felt generous. The Japanese military code of Bushido viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. Soldiers who had given up rather than fight to the death deserved no respect, no consideration, no basic human decency. This contempt would fuel systematic brutality that violated every convention of warfare. Civilians suffered even more. In the Dutch East Indies, Indonesian workers found themselves conscripted into forced labor gangs, building military installations under the tropical sun with minimal food and water. Chinese civilians in occupied territories faced systematic execution. Anyone suspected of supporting Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was eliminated without trial. The Suk Ching massacre in Singapore became emblematic of Japanese occupation policy. Between February 18th and March 4th, 1942, Japanese forces systematically rounded up Chinese men between the ages of 18 and 50. Those deemed anti-Japanese were trucked to remote beaches and executed. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, from several thousand to tens of thousands civilians murdered in cold blood. Yet from Tokyo's perspective, everything was proceeding according to plan. The Southern Resource Area, Japan's term for Southeast Asia's oil, rubber and tin, was now firmly under imperial control. Tankers loaded with precious petroleum steamed toward Japanese refineries. Convoys, carrying raw materials that had been embargoed by the Western powers, now flowed freely to Japanese factories. The speed of success had even surprised Japanese planners. Military timetables that had allowed 6 months for conquest were completed in 4. Staff officers in Tokyo began discussing what to do with all the excess troops now available for new operations. Should they drive toward Australia, push deeper into the Indian Ocean, perhaps even launch probing attacks toward the American West Coast? Official pronouncements suggested imperial approval for continued expansion. In his rare public appearances, the emperor spoke of Japan's sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. Though historians debate the extent of Hirohito's direct involvement in military planning, the expansion certainly proceeded with the blessing of official imperial rhetoric. But beneath the surface confidence, some Japanese leaders harbored deeper concerns. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood better than most what Japan had awakened. America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. Once fully mobilized, the United States could produce ships, planes, and weapons at a rate that would overwhelm any enemy. The window of opportunity was closing. Every day that passed allowed America to rebuild its shattered Pacific fleet. Every week gave American factories more time to churn out the weapons of war. If Japan was to secure its empire permanently, it needed to strike again, and soon. By late April 1942, the Japanese Empire had reached its absolute zenith. From the snow-covered Aleutian Islands to the steaming jungles of Burma, the rising sun flew triumphant. In 4 short months, Japan had dismantled the colonial order that had dominated Asia for centuries. But empires built on the momentum of conquest face a fundamental problem. They must keep conquering or risk losing everything. And in Washington, London, and Moscow, Allied leaders were already planning their response to Japan's stunning victories. The next phase of the Pacific War was about to begin. The relationship between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt had been forged in the crucible of war, but it was tested like never before in the wake of Pearl Harbor. When the British Prime Minister received word of the Japanese attack, he later admitted feeling a surge of relief. America was finally, fully, irrevocably in the war. Churchill wasted no time. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, he was aboard the battleship Duke of York, racing across the Atlantic through U-boat-infested waters. The journey was perilous. German submarines prowled the shipping lanes, and the Duke of York carried the most valuable target in the British Empire. On December 22, 1941, Churchill arrived in Washington for what would become known as the Arcadia Conference. Roosevelt met him at the White House with genuine warmth, but both leaders understood the gravity of their situation. The Axis powers now controlled territory from the Arctic Circle to the tropical Pacific. Never in human history had democracy faced such an existential threat. 4 days later, on December 26th, Churchill stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver one of the most important speeches of his career. The House chamber was packed. Senators, representatives, Supreme Court justices, and military leaders all gathered to hear from Britain's wartime leader. Churchill's voice resonated through the chamber as he addressed Japan's leaders directly. "What kind of a people do they think we are?" he thundered. "Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson that they and the world will never forget?" The applause was thunderous, but Churchill wasn't finished. He painted a vision of Allied victory that seemed almost impossible given their current circumstances. "We have at least 4/5 of the population of the globe upon our side. We are responsible for their safety and their future." Behind the public rhetoric, however, the private discussions between Churchill and Roosevelt revealed deep strategic disagreements. The British Prime Minister desperately needed American forces in Europe to relieve pressure on his beleaguered nation. Britain had been fighting alone since France's fall in June 1940, and Churchill feared his island nation might not survive another year without direct American intervention. Roosevelt faced a different calculus. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a direct assault on American territory, killing over 2,000 American servicemen. Public opinion, led by newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts, demanded immediate and overwhelming retaliation against Japan. How could the president explain to grieving families that their priority was helping Britain rather than avenging Pearl Harbor? The compromise they reached would shape the entire war. Germany would remain the primary enemy, the Europe-first strategy that Churchill desperately wanted. But Roosevelt insisted on significant Pacific operations to maintain American public support. The United States would fight a two-ocean war whether Britain liked it or not. Behind closed doors, Roosevelt's rage at the Japanese attack was palpable. Harry Hopkins, the president's closest advisor, later described Roosevelt's private fury as unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The president had genuinely believed that diplomatic negotiations might prevent war in the Pacific. Japan's treacherous attack, while their ambassadors were still in Washington, felt like a personal betrayal. But Roosevelt was also a pragmatist. He understood that American industrial might would ultimately determine the war's outcome, but it would take time to mobilize. Factories had to be converted from civilian to military production. Workers had to be trained. New shipyards and aircraft plants had to be built from scratch. The challenge was buying that time. Every day that Japan consolidated its conquests made eventual victory more costly. Roosevelt needed some way to strike back immediately, not just for military advantage, but to maintain American morale and show the world that America was still fighting. The solution came from an unexpected source. General Henry Hap Arnold, chief of the Army Air Forces, suggested that long-range bombers might be able to reach Japan from aircraft carriers. The idea seemed preposterous. Medium bombers had never launched from carrier decks before. But Roosevelt was intrigued by the psychological impact such a raid might have. Meanwhile, the alliance itself was taking shape. On January 1st, 1942, representatives from 26 nations signed the Declaration by United Nations, formally establishing the alliance that would fight the Axis powers. The document committed each nation to use its full resources against the Axis and pledged not to make a separate peace. But unity on paper was easier than unity in practice. British and American military leaders clashed repeatedly over strategy, logistics, and command structures. Admiral Ernest King, the abrasive chief of U.S. naval operations, made no secret of his belief that Britain was trying to use American blood to preserve its empire. British generals, meanwhile, viewed their American counterparts as inexperienced amateurs who didn't understand modern warfare. Stalin presented an entirely different challenge. The Soviet dictator was fighting for his nation's survival against German armies that had reached the suburbs of Moscow. He demanded immediate establishment of a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army. When told that such an operation was impossible before 1943 at the earliest, Stalin's rage was legendary. The personal dynamics between the three Allied leaders would prove crucial. Churchill and Roosevelt developed a genuine friendship based on shared democratic values and mutual respect. Both men were gifted communicators who understood the power of public opinion in democratic societies. Stalin remained the outsider, necessary for victory, but fundamentally alien to Western democratic traditions. As winter turned to spring in 1942, the Grand Alliance faced its first major test. Japanese forces were advancing toward Australia, while German armies prepared for another massive offensive in Russia. British forces in North Africa were being pushed back toward Egypt by Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Axis seemed to be winning everywhere. Roosevelt's determination to strike back at Japan became an obsession. He peppered military leaders with questions about offensive operations, demanding to know why American forces weren't already counterattacking. The president understood that public morale was as important as military strategy. Americans needed to see their forces fighting back, not just defending. The answer would come from an unlikely collaboration between the Navy and Army Air Forces. But first, American forces would have to survive the growing crisis in the Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur's troops were being slowly strangled by Japanese forces closing in from all sides. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived in Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, to find a scene of devastation that defied comprehension. The harbor that had been the pride of the Pacific Fleet just 3 weeks earlier was now a graveyard of twisted steel and sunken ships. The statistics were heartbreaking. 18 major warships had been sunk or severely damaged, including 8 battleships, the backbone of American naval power. Over 300 aircraft lay destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Most devastating of all, 2,403 American servicemen would never return home. As Nimitz surveyed the wreckage from the deck of his flagship, the reality of his assignment became clear. He had been ordered to take command of the Pacific Fleet and somehow restore American naval supremacy across an ocean covering 65 million square miles. With what remained of his forces, he was expected to halt Japanese expansion, protect the American West Coast, and eventually carry the war to Japan itself. The traditional foundation of naval power, the battleship, was gone. Arizona had exploded with such violence that her forward magazines detonated, killing 1,177 sailors in minutes. Oklahoma had capsized completely, trapping over 400 men inside her hull. West Virginia and California had settled into the harbor mud, their crews fighting desperately to save what they could. But as Nimitz walked through the chaos of Pearl Harbor, he began to notice something that would prove crucial. The dry docks were damaged but repairable. The fuel storage tanks, containing millions of gallons of precious oil, were untouched. Most importantly, the submarine base remained operational. And then there were the aircraft carriers. Enterprise had been delivering aircraft to Wake Island when the attack came. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing maintenance. By pure chance, the ships that would prove most valuable in the Pacific War had escaped destruction. Nimitz was a soft-spoken man who rarely raised his voice, but he possessed a strategic mind that grasped the implications immediately. If battleships were obsolete, carriers would become the new capital ships. If long-range gunnery was irrelevant, naval aviation would determine victory. The disaster at Pearl Harbor had actually forced the Navy to embrace the future of naval warfare. But Nimitz faced challenges that went far beyond damaged ships. American naval doctrine, refined over decades, was built around battleship actions between opposing fleets. Most officers had no experience with carrier operations over vast distances. The tactics, logistics, and coordination required for carrier warfare were largely untested in actual combat. Personnel presented another crisis. Thousands of experienced sailors and aviators had been killed or wounded at Pearl Harbor. Training new crews would take months that Nimitz didn't have. Meanwhile, Japanese forces were advancing across the Pacific, seizing new bases and extending their defensive perimeter with each passing day. The scope of the Pacific theater made European operations seem simple by comparison. Distances that would span the entire Atlantic Ocean were considered routine supply runs in the Pacific. From Pearl Harbor to Tokyo was 3,400 miles, farther than from London to New York. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, every spare part had to be transported across thousands of miles of open ocean. Japanese submarines now prowled the shipping lanes, turning every convoy into a deadly gamble. Some Japanese long-range submarines possessed remarkable endurance and could operate for extended periods, with certain models even carrying reconnaissance seaplanes. They maintained radio contact with Tokyo, coordinating attacks on American supply lines. Nimitz's first priority was establishing secure bases from which to launch counteroffensives. But the map revealed a sobering reality. Every suitable island was either too far from Japan to be useful or already under Japanese control. Building new bases would require massive engineering efforts, under constant threat of enemy attack. The solution lay in a chain of remote islands stretching across the central Pacific. New Caledonia, Fiji, and the New Hebrides could serve as stepping stones toward Japan, but only if they could be fortified before Japanese forces arrived. Army engineers were already en route, but their transports moved painfully slowly through submarine-infested waters. Communication presented yet another challenge. Radio signals across the Pacific were unreliable, subject to atmospheric interference and enemy interception. Coordinating operations between carriers hundreds of miles apart required timing precision that was often impossible to achieve. One missed radio call could result in friendly forces attacking each other or failing to coordinate strikes on enemy targets. But Nimitz possessed one advantage that would prove decisive: the Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had been working to break Japanese naval codes since before the war began. The Pearl Harbor attack had actually provided them with valuable intelligence about Japanese communication procedures and code usage. By February 1942, Rochefort's team was reading portions of Japanese naval messages. They couldn't decode everything, but they could identify ship movements, unit designations, and sometimes even operational plans. This intelligence advantage would prove more valuable than a dozen battleships in the campaigns to come. Nimitz also benefited from his choice of subordinates. Admiral William Bull, Halsey commanded Task Force 16 with aggressive determination that matched his nickname. Halsey had been at sea when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and his fury at the Japanese was legendary among his crews. He would prove willing to take risks that more cautious commanders might avoid. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher led Task Force 17 with methodical precision that complemented Halsey's aggression. Fletcher understood carrier operations better than most flag officers and possessed the patience to wait for optimal attack conditions. Together, Halsey and Fletcher would give Nimitz the tactical flexibility he needed to challenge Japanese expansion. As spring arrived in the Pacific, Nimitz faced the harsh reality of his situation. Japanese forces were closing in on Australia, while American reinforcements were still months away. The enemy held every advantage: superior numbers, established bases, experienced crews, and the momentum of unbroken victory. But Nimitz also understood something that Japanese commanders did not. America's industrial capacity was beginning to mobilize on a scale never before seen in human history. Shipyards were working around the clock to produce new vessels. Aircraft factories were rolling out fighters and bombers at an accelerating pace. If he could buy time for American production to reach full capacity, the tide of war would inevitably turn. The question was whether he could hold on long enough for that industrial miracle to save them all. General Douglas MacArthur stood on the dock at Corregidor Island on March 11, 1942, facing the most painful decision of his military career. Behind him, the Fortress Island's guns still thundered defiance at Japanese positions across Manila Bay. Ahead lay a PT boat that would carry him to safety and away from the troops he had sworn to defend. President Roosevelt's orders were explicit. MacArthur was to escape to Australia and take command of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. The Philippines were lost, and America could not afford to lose its most experienced field commander to Japanese captivity. But MacArthur's heart rebelled against leaving his men to face inevitable defeat alone. As the PT boat's engines roared to life, MacArthur turned back toward the fortress and spoke words that would become legend. "I shall return." 3 simple words that carried the weight of a promise, a threat, and a prayer, all combined into one defiant declaration that Japan's triumph in the Philippines would not be permanent. The crisis had been building since December 8, 1941, when Japanese bombers appeared over Clark Field just 10 hours after Pearl Harbor. Despite advance warning of the Hawaiian attack, MacArthur's Air Force was caught completely unprepared. 18 precious B-17 flying fortresses, half of America's heavy bomber strength in the Pacific, were destroyed on the ground, along with 56 fighters. Within days, Japanese landing forces had established beachheads across Luzon Island. The pre-war plan, War Plan Orange, had called for American and Filipino forces to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and hold out until the Pacific Fleet arrived with reinforcements. But the Pacific Fleet lay shattered at Pearl Harbor, and no reinforcements were coming. By January 2nd, 1942, Manila had fallen without a fight. MacArthur had declared it an open city to prevent civilian casualties, but Japanese forces entered with their characteristic brutality nonetheless. The sight of enemy troops marching through the capital of America's oldest Pacific territory sent shockwaves through Washington and Australian cities alike. The retreat to Bataan became a nightmare of military collapse. Supply dumps that should have been moved to the peninsula were captured intact by advancing Japanese forces. Food stocks, calculated to last 6 months, were consumed in 6 weeks as civilian refugees flooded into the defensive zone. Medical supplies disappeared as tropical diseases ran rampant through overcrowded camps. General Jonathan Wainwright, MacArthur's most trusted subordinate, inherited command of a force that was already doomed. 78,000 American and Filipino troops crowded into defensive positions designed for 40,000. Daily rations were cut to 1,500 calories, then 1,000, then 800, barely enough to sustain life, let alone combat effectiveness. Japanese General Masaharu Homma had expected to complete the conquest of the Philippines by January 23rd. Instead, his forces found themselves locked in brutal jungle warfare against defenders who had nothing left to lose. American and Filipino troops, despite disease and starvation, held their positions with desperate courage that amazed their enemies. The siege became a war of attrition that Japan had not planned for. Homma's forces suffered heavy casualties, attacking defensive positions that made use of every natural advantage. Swamps, ravines, and dense jungle growth turned every advance into a bloody slog that consumed men and supplies at an alarming rate. But hunger was an enemy that no amount of courage could defeat. By March, American troops were eating anything they could find: grass, bark, leaves, and occasionally cats and dogs from abandoned villages. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi ravaged units already weakened by months of inadequate nutrition. Men who had been healthy soldiers in December could barely stand by April. The end came suddenly. On April 3rd, 1942, Homma launched a massive artillery bombardment followed by coordinated infantry attacks all along the American line. Troops too weak to fight effectively watched helplessly as Japanese forces broke through positions they had held for 3 months. By April 9th, organized resistance had collapsed. General Edward King, commanding the Luzon force, made the agonizing decision to surrender. Against explicit orders from MacArthur and Wainwright, King chose to save the lives of his men rather than fight to the last bullet. At 3:30 p.m. on April 9th, white flags appeared along the Bataan front, marking one of the largest surrenders in American military history. What followed would become known as the Bataan Death March, a 60-mile forced march that revealed the true nature of Japanese military culture. To Japanese soldiers raised on the Bushido Code, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Men who chose captivity over death deserved no mercy, no consideration, no basic human dignity. 78,000 prisoners began the march under a burning tropical sun. Japanese guards, themselves exhausted from months of jungle fighting, showed no patience for prisoners who couldn't keep pace. Men who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Those who asked for water were beaten with rifle butts. The sick and wounded were abandoned to die in the jungle heat. American survivors later described scenes that defied human comprehension. Japanese soldiers forced prisoners to bury their own comrades alive. Guards used Allied prisoners for bayonet practice, laughing as they inflicted wounds designed to cause maximum suffering. Officers who protested the treatment of their men were singled out for special brutality. The exact death toll remains disputed among historians, but estimates suggest that thousands of Allied prisoners died during the march or in the camps that followed. Many more would perish in the months and years of captivity that lay ahead. For those who survived, the psychological scars would last a lifetime. News of the death march reached America through escaped prisoners and Filipino guerrillas. War correspondents filed stories that shocked the American public and stiffened resolve for total victory over Japan. Recruitment posters featuring images of tortured American prisoners appeared in every major city, accompanied by slogans demanding vengeance for Bataan. On May 6, 1942, the last American stronghold in the Philippines fell silent. General Wainwright, trapped on Corregidor Island with 11,000 troops, finally accepted the inevitable and surrendered. The American flag was lowered over the fortress that had guarded Manila Bay since the Spanish-American War, marking the end of American presence in the Philippines. But, even in defeat, the Philippine campaign had served a crucial strategic purpose. Homer's forces had been tied down for 5 months in operations that were supposed to last 5 weeks. Japanese divisions needed elsewhere in the Pacific had been committed to reducing American resistance in the Philippines. Most importantly, the heroic defense had bought precious time for American forces to establish defensive positions in Australia and the Southwest Pacific. The price had been terrible, an entire army destroyed, thousands dead, tens of thousands facing years of brutal captivity. But from MacArthur's headquarters in Australia came a promise that sustained hope through the darkest days of the war. America would return to the Philippines, and when it did, the reckoning would be complete. The idea seemed so preposterous that most military experts dismissed it immediately. Launch long-range bombers from an aircraft carrier? Impossible. B-25 Mitchell bombers weighed over 30,000 pounds, fully loaded, and typically needed well over 1,000 feet of runway under ordinary conditions, much more than any carrier deck could provide. The longest aircraft carrier deck in the American fleet measured just over 800 feet. But President Roosevelt wasn't interested in expert opinions. By February 1942, American morale had reached its lowest point since the Civil War. Japanese forces were advancing on all fronts, while American newspapers published photographs of burning ships at Pearl Harbor and defeated troops in the Philippines. The president needed something dramatic, something that would shock the world and prove that America was still capable of striking back. Roosevelt's demand was simple and direct. Find a way to bomb Japan. Not in 6 months when new bases were established, not in a year when the fleet was rebuilt, but now, while the enemy still believed they were untouchable. When military planners protested that such an operation was technically impossible, Roosevelt's response was equally direct: make it possible. The challenge fell to Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle, one of America's most accomplished aviators and aeronautical engineers. Doolittle had earned a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, won the Schneider Trophy for seaplane racing, and set numerous aviation records throughout the 1920s and 30s. His combination of theoretical knowledge and practical flying experience made him uniquely qualified to solve what appeared to be an impossible engineering problem. The mathematical problems were staggering. A fully loaded B-25 required a takeoff speed of approximately 95 miles per hour under normal conditions. Aircraft carriers steamed at 30 knots maximum speed, providing a headwind of only 35 miles per hour. That left 60 miles per hour to be achieved through engine power alone across less than 500 feet of usable deck space. The physics seemed to make success impossible. Doolittle's solution required fundamentally reimagining what constituted a normal B-25 configuration. Working with North American aviation engineers, he began stripping the bombers down to their absolute essentials. The bottom gun turrets were removed completely, saving 800 pounds of weight and reducing drag. Armor plating was eliminated wherever possible without compromising structural integrity. Even the radio equipment was reduced to basic communication gear, since the bombers would be operating beyond normal radio range anyway. Most dramatically, the fuel systems were completely reconfigured. Additional fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay and every available space within the aircraft. But even with maximum fuel capacity, the bombers could carry only enough gasoline to reach Japan, not enough to return to the carrier. This created another seemingly impossible problem that would define the entire mission's character. Where would the bombers land after completing their mission? The Soviet Union was technically an ally, but Stalin had made it clear that his non-aggression pact with Japan took precedence over cooperation with America in the Pacific. China was the only feasible option, but Chinese airfields were primitive, and many were already under Japanese control. The crews would have to navigate across 800 miles of Japanese-occupied territory, drop their bombs, then continue another 600 miles to reach nationalist Chinese forces. If they survived the bombing run, they would still face a desperate escape through enemy territory with virtually no fuel remaining. Despite the odds, volunteers stepped forward in overwhelming numbers when Doolittle explained the mission parameters to bomber crews at Columbia Army Air Base in South Carolina. He was brutally honest about their chances of survival. This would be a one-way mission, with minimal prospects for successful escape. Anyone who wanted to withdraw could do so with no questions asked and no damage to their military record. Not a single man stepped back. The volunteer crews represented some of the finest aircrew in the Army Air Forces. Captain Ted Lawson had logged over 1,000 hours in B-25s and was considered one of the best medium bomber pilots in the service. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark was a navigation specialist who had trained other pilots in long-range overwater flight techniques. Sergeant Fred Bramer, selected as Doolittle's bombardier, had achieved the highest accuracy scores in his training class. Each crew member understood that their survival depended not just on individual skill, but on flawless coordination under impossible circumstances. The training regimen was unlike anything attempted before in military aviation. Crews practiced takeoffs from white lines painted on runways to simulate carrier deck lengths. They learned to get airborne in distances that military manuals said were marginal for their aircraft under ideal conditions. Navigation training focused on long-distance overwater flight using only compass headings and dead reckoning. Radar and radio beacons would be useless over enemy territory, where electronic emissions could reveal their position. Bombing practice presented unique challenges that revealed the mission's primarily psychological objectives. The crews couldn't be told their actual target for security reasons, so they practiced against targets that resembled Japanese industrial facilities without being informed of the resemblance. They trained to attack from extremely low altitude, 300 feet or less, to avoid Japanese fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire. At such heights, the margin for error was essentially zero, but low-level attacks would maximize the psychological impact of American bombs exploding in Japanese cities. Technical modifications continued right up until the mission launch. Special low-pressure tires were installed to reduce weight and improve takeoff performance on the short carrier deck. Propeller pitch was adjusted for maximum acceleration during the critical takeoff roll. Engine timing was refined to extract every possible horsepower during the few seconds when power-to-weight ratio would determine success or failure. Doolittle even experimented with special fuel mixtures that provided extra power for takeoff, though at the risk of engine damage during the long flight to Japan. The bomb loads reflected the mission's primary purpose as a morale operation rather than a strategic bombing campaign. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs, a mixture of high explosive and incendiary devices designed to cause maximum visible damage to Japanese cities. The total explosive power was minimal compared to what later bombing campaigns would deliver, but the psychological impact of American bombs falling on Japanese soil would be immeasurable. Japanese military leaders had assured their population that the home islands were completely safe from enemy attack. Doolittle's mission would prove them catastrophically wrong. Weather forecasting became a critical component of mission planning. Pacific weather patterns in April were notoriously unpredictable, with storms that could make carrier operations impossible. Clear skies would expose the task force to Japanese reconnaissance flights, while heavy weather could prevent the bombers from finding their targets. Doolittle needed perfect conditions, enough wind to aid takeoff, sufficient cloud cover to hide the carriers, but clear enough weather over Japan for accurate bombing. The window for success would be measured in hours, possibly minutes. As March turned to April, the modified bombers were secretly loaded aboard the USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in California. Even Hornet's crew didn't know their destination, as the carrier departed on April 2nd with 16 B-25s strapped to her flight deck. The sight of Army bombers aboard a Navy carrier generated rumors and speculation throughout the fleet, but operational security held firm. Cover stories suggested the bombers were being ferried to Hawaii or Australia, but the most observant sailors noticed that the aircraft were armed and fueled for combat operations. The technical challenges multiplied exponentially at sea. Salt spray corroded aircraft engines and instruments, despite protective covers and constant maintenance. High seas threatened to wash the bombers overboard, despite heavy tie-down cables and round-the-clock security watches. Most critically, the crews had never actually attempted a carrier takeoff. All their training had been on land-based runways, with painted lines simulating carrier dimensions. They would get exactly one chance to prove that the impossible was merely extremely difficult. Doolittle himself would lead the mission, flying the first bomber off the deck to demonstrate that takeoff was actually possible. At 55 years old, he was considered too valuable for such a dangerous mission, but he insisted that he couldn't ask men to do something he wouldn't do himself. His crew included some of the most experienced navigators and bombardiers in the Army Air Forces, but experience couldn't eliminate the fundamental risks they all faced. If the lead bomber failed to get airborne, it would crash into the ocean and possibly damage the carrier deck, making subsequent takeoffs impossible. The psychological pressure on individual crew members was enormous. Lieutenant Robert Gray, piloting the 10th bomber in the formation, later wrote that the nights before launch were filled with detailed discussions of survival techniques and escape procedures. Crews studied maps of eastern China, memorized basic Chinese phrases, and discussed what to do if captured by Japanese forces. The Geneva Convention theoretically protected prisoners of war, but everyone understood that Japanese treatment of captured airmen was likely to be brutal beyond imagination. As the Hornet steamed west toward Japan, every man aboard understood they were attempting something that had never been tried before in the history of warfare. Success would prove that Japan was vulnerable and that American resolve remained unbroken despite the disasters of the previous 4 months. Failure would hand Japan a significant propaganda victory and likely cost the lives of some of America's best airmen. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the margin for error couldn't have been smaller. Admiral William Bull Halsey stood on the bridge of USS Enterprise, his flagship cutting through heavy Pacific swells as it escorted the most unusual naval force in American history. 68 warships surrounded the precious Hornet, whose flight deck bristled with 16 olive-drab Army bombers that had no business being at sea. But for Halsey, this mission was intensely personal, rooted in a fury that had been building since December 7th. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Halsey had been 250 miles west of Hawaii delivering aircraft to Wake Island. He had watched the smoke rising over Pearl Harbor from Enterprise's deck and sworn an oath that would define the rest of his war. Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell. Now, 4 months later, he finally had the chance to begin making good on that promise. The journey to the launch point was fraught with dangers that multiplied with every mile west. Japanese submarines patrolled the shipping lanes between Hawaii and Japan, their periscopes searching for exactly the kind of high-value target that Halsey was escorting. A single torpedo hit on Hornet would destroy the bombers and eliminate any chance of striking back at Japan for months to come. Intelligence reports suggested that at least 12 Japanese submarines were operating in the intended route, their captains under orders to report any unusual American naval activity. Halsey's task force maintained strict radio silence as it approached enemy waters. Navigation relied on dead reckoning and celestial observations, with constant course corrections to avoid known Japanese patrol areas. The weather was uncooperative. High seas made flight operations dangerous, while thick clouds reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. But poor visibility also concealed the American ships from Japanese reconnaissance flights that regularly swept the ocean approaches to Japan. Fuel consumption became a constant concern as the task force steamed deeper into enemy territory. The destroyers escorting the carriers had limited range and would need to refuel from tankers if the mission timeline extended beyond the planned 48 hours. But refueling operations would expose the entire force to submarine attack and might reveal their position to Japanese patrol aircraft. Every hour of delay increased the risk of detection and catastrophic failure of the entire operation. Communication between ships relied on signal lights and semaphore flags to maintain radio silence. Weather conditions often made visual signals impossible to read, forcing dangerous close formation steaming that increased collision risks in heavy seas. Halsey's staff developed elaborate contingency plans for various scenarios: submarine contact, aircraft detection, mechanical failures aboard Hornet, or weather conditions that would prevent bomber launches. Each contingency involved difficult decisions about whether to abort the mission or accept even greater risks to achieve their objective. By April 17th, the task force had penetrated to within 700 miles of Tokyo without detection. Doolittle's bombers were fueled and armed, their crews making final preparations for a dawn launch on April 18th. The plan called for takeoff at 4:30 a.m., giving the bombers enough daylight to navigate to their targets while arriving over Japan during the busy morning hours when their engines might be mistaken for routine air traffic. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to the carefully choreographed timeline. But at 7:30 a.m. on April 18th, everything changed in a matter of minutes. A Japanese patrol vessel, the Nito Maru, appeared through the morning haze, clearly visible from Enterprise's bridge. The small fishing boat was equipped with radio gear and had almost certainly spotted the American task force before being detected itself. Within minutes, Japanese radio operators would be reporting the presence of American carriers deep in Japanese territorial waters. Halsey faced an agonizing decision that would determine the fate of the entire mission. The original plan called for launching the bombers 600 miles from Japan, giving them enough fuel to reach Chinese airfields after completing their bombing runs. From their current position, 650 miles out, the bombers would be operating at the absolute limit of their range. Many might not have enough fuel to reach friendly territory after the bombing run, condemning their crews to death or capture in enemy territory. But waiting was no longer an option that any rational commander could consider. Japanese bombers based on the home islands could reach the task force within 2 hours of receiving the patrol boat's warning. Zero fighters from nearby carriers might already be launching to intercept the American ships. If Halsey delayed the bomber launch to reach the optimal position, he risked losing both the bombers and the irreplaceable aircraft carriers that had brought them this far. The decision to launch immediately meant condemning Doolittle's crews to an even more desperate mission than originally planned. Instead of reaching their targets with minimal fuel reserves, they would arrive with virtually empty tanks. The chances of reaching Chinese airfields had dropped from difficult to nearly impossible, but the alternative was certain destruction of the entire mission force and a propaganda victory for Japan that would devastate American morale. Enterprise's guns opened fire on the Nito Maru, sending the patrol vessel to the bottom before it could complete its radio transmission. But damage assessment indicated that at least part of the warning message had been sent before the ship was silenced. Japanese commanders would soon know that American carriers were operating in home waters, even if they didn't know the exact location or purpose of the task force. The element of surprise was compromised, but not entirely lost. Halsey's signal to Hornet was brief and decisive. Launch Planes X to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command. Good luck and God bless you. The message reached Doolittle as he was making final pre-flight checks on his B-25. The colonel understood immediately what the early launch meant for his crew's survival chances, but there was no time for second thoughts or mission modifications. History was waiting, and the window of opportunity was closing rapidly with each passing minute. The first challenge was simply getting airborne from a pitching carrier deck in heavy seas. Hornet's flight deck rose and fell 30 feet with each wave, requiring split-second timing for takeoff. Too early, and the bomber would drop toward the ocean as the deck fell away beneath it. Too late, and the aircraft would launch into a wave face and cartwheel into the sea. Doolittle would have to time his takeoff to the exact moment when the deck reached its highest point in the wave cycle. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle pushed his throttles forward and felt his B-25 strain against the wheel chocks holding it in position. Behind him, 15 other crews watched from their cockpits, knowing that if the lead bomber failed to get airborne, the entire mission would end before it began. The deck officer dropped his flag, signalling the launch. The chocks were pulled away, and Doolittle's bomber lurched forward into the most important takeoff in American aviation history. 467 feet later, Doolittle's bomber lifted off the deck with barely 10 feet to spare above the churning ocean. One by one, the remaining bombers followed, each takeoff a minor miracle of timing, technique, and raw courage. By 9:20 a.m., all 16 aircraft were airborne and climbing toward their cruising altitude, leaving behind the safety of the task force for the deadly skies over Japan. There was no turning back now. Their fuel situation made it impossible to return to the carriers, even if they wanted to abort the mission. At exactly 12:30 p.m. Tokyo time, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 appeared over the Japanese capital at 300 feet altitude, flying faster and lower than any foreign aircraft had ever flown over the Emperor's palace. Air raid sirens began wailing across the city as Japanese civilians looked up in disbelief at the impossible sight of American bombers over their homeland. The psychological shock was more devastating than any physical damage the bombers could inflict. Japan had not suffered foreign air attacks on its home islands in modern warfare, and the appearance of American bombers shattered fundamental assumptions about homeland security. The home islands were considered sacred territory, protected by geographic isolation and naval supremacy. Now American bombs were falling on Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya, while Japanese fighters scrambled helplessly to intercept raiders that had already completed their primary mission. Doolittle's bomber targeted the Shiba district of Tokyo, where aircraft factories and military installations clustered near the Emperor's palace. Flying at telephone pole height to avoid anti-aircraft fire, Bombardier Sergeant Fred Bramer released 4 500-pound bombs with devastating precision. Explosions erupted across the target area as incendiary devices ignited fuel storage tanks and wooden factory buildings. Black smoke billowed skyward, visible for miles and serving as a beacon for the bombers that followed Doolittle's lead aircraft. The Japanese response was chaotic and completely ineffective despite months of preparation and planning. Fighter squadrons launched from airfields around Tokyo, but their pilots had no idea where the attackers had come from or where they were going. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire across the city, but their crews had never practiced against targets flying at such low altitude and high speed. Most shells exploded harmlessly above the bombers or fell short of their rapidly moving targets, while some guns actually fired on Japanese aircraft in the confusion. Radio communications across Japan dissolved into panic and contradictory orders. Military commanders demanded to know how American bombers had reached the home islands without being detected by the elaborate early warning network. Air defense officers reported multiple raids in progress, but couldn't coordinate effective responses because they had no information about the attackers' origin or escape routes. Some Japanese pilots even attacked their own aircraft in the confusion, mistaking domestic planes for additional American raiders in the smoke and chaos over Japanese cities. Captain Ted Lawson, piloting the 7th bomber in the formation, targeted industrial facilities in the Tokyo Bay area with mechanical precision. His bombardier, Sergeant Robert Clever, aimed for what appeared to be an aircraft engine factory surrounded by fuel storage tanks. The bombs struck their target perfectly, triggering secondary explosions that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air and created a pillar of smoke visible throughout the Tokyo metropolitan area. As Lawson banked away from the target, he could see Japanese workers fleeing the burning facility while fire trucks raced through the streets below. The physical damage was actually minimal by later wartime standards and would be quickly repaired. 16 bombers carrying 4 bombs each could not seriously cripple Japan's industrial capacity or significantly impact the war effort. But the psychological impact was immeasurable and would influence Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, no part of Japan was safe from attack, The myth of Japanese invulnerability was shattered forever, and with it, the confidence that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. Emperor Hirohito himself demanded an immediate explanation from his military commanders when reports of the bombing reached the imperial palace. How had enemy aircraft penetrated Japan's elaborate defense network without detection? Where had they come from, and how could such attacks be prevented in the future? When told that the bombers had probably launched from American aircraft carriers, the emperor ordered an immediate and comprehensive review of Japan's entire defensive strategy and resource allocation. General Hideki Tojo, Japan's prime minister and war minister, was reportedly furious beyond coherent expression when briefed on the attack. The bombing had occurred during a planned air raid drill, making the government's failure to protect the capital even more humiliating and politically damaging. Tojo ordered the immediate investigation of any officer found responsible for the security failure, but the subsequent inquiry revealed that no single person was at fault. The entire Japanese military establishment had been caught completely unprepared for an attack that their own planning had deemed impossible. As the last American bomber disappeared over the western horizon toward China, Japanese radio operators frantically transmitted warnings to military units across the Pacific. Aircraft carriers and fighter squadrons were recalled from offensive operations to defend the home islands against possible follow-up attacks. Thousands of troops were redeployed from occupied territories to strengthen homeland defenses. Resources that might have been used for further territorial expansion were now committed to preventing additional raids on Japan itself, fundamentally altering Japanese strategic priorities for the remainder of the war. But for Doolittle's crews, the most dangerous part of their mission was just beginning as they faced the desperate challenge of reaching Chinese territory before their engines quit. Some crews would make it to friendly airfields and eventually return to American forces after harrowing escapes through enemy territory. Others would crash in Japanese-occupied areas and face capture, torture, and execution at the hands of captors who viewed them as war criminals rather than legitimate prisoners of war. Captain David Jones, piloting Bomber No. 6, ran out of fuel over the China Sea and was forced to ditch in shallow water near the Chinese coast. His crew survived the crash landing, but was captured by Japanese patrol boats before they could reach shore or make contact with Chinese resistance forces. They would spend the next 3 years in Japanese prisoner of war camps, where 2 crew members would die from malnutrition, disease, and systematic abuse. Jones himself would survive the ordeal, but barely, weighing only 90 pounds when liberated by American forces in 1945. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's bomber also fell short of Chinese territory, crashing in Japanese-occupied coastal waters after running out of fuel. Hallmark and his crew were captured immediately and transported to Tokyo for interrogation by military intelligence officers. After months of torture and solitary confinement designed to extract information about American military capabilities, Hallmark and 2 of his crew members were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. Their deaths violated every convention of warfare, but Japan's treatment of captured airmen would only grow more brutal as the war continued and American bombing campaigns intensified. The crews who successfully reached Chinese territory faced different but equally deadly challenges from Japanese occupation forces actively hunting for the American airmen. Chinese nationalist forces controlled only portions of eastern China, and Japanese patrols were scouring the countryside for any trace of the bomber crews. Local Chinese civilians risked their lives to shelter and guide the Americans toward friendly territory, despite knowing the terrible consequences they would face if caught helping enemy personnel escape Japanese custody. The Chinese population paid a horrific price for their assistance to the Doolittle raiders. Japanese forces launched Operation Seigo in systematic retaliation for Chinese aid to the American airmen. Over the next several months, Japanese troops methodically destroyed Chinese villages suspected of helping American airmen escape. Estimates of Chinese civilian casualties in these reprisals vary among historians, but sources, including American military museums, cite figures of up to 250,000 Chinese civilians killed in retaliation for the Doolittle raid, though this figure remains debated and should be considered an approximate estimate rather than a precisely documented total. Doolittle himself crash-landed in a rice paddy near Kuzhou and was rescued by Chinese guerrillas who guided him through Japanese lines to safety in nationalist-controlled territory. The man who had led the impossible mission would eventually return to American forces and receive the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt in a White House ceremony. But he would always carry the emotional burden of knowing how many Chinese civilians had died because of his raid on Japan. The cost of striking the untouchable had been measured not just in American lives, but in the blood of innocent civilians caught between two empires locked in total war. The Doolittle raid had accomplished far more than Jimmy Doolittle ever imagined. Beyond the psychological shock of bombs falling on Tokyo, the attack intensified existing strategic tensions within Japanese high command that would reshape the entire Pacific War. Multiple competing pressures, Army versus Navy priorities, resource constraints, defensive versus offensive thinking, created a complex decision-making environment where no single strategy could satisfy all requirements. Fleet Admiral Osamu Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, advocated for continuing the southward advance that had brought Japan such spectacular success since Pearl Harbor. Seize Australia, or at least isolate it from American support, and secure the resource-rich territories that Japan needed for long-term survival. The southern resource area was producing the oil, rubber, and metals that Japanese industry required, but these supply lines remained vulnerable to Allied counterattack from bases in Australia and New Zealand. Only by pushing the defensive perimeter further south could Japan guarantee permanent control of these vital resources. Nagano's approach reflected traditional Japanese military thinking that emphasized territorial control and defensive consolidation. Japanese army leaders strongly supported this strategy because it promised new territories to occupy and administer, expanding their institutional influence. The plan was methodical. Japanese forces would seize Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, establishing air bases that could threaten northern Australia. From these positions, Japanese bombers could attack Allied shipping lanes and prevent American reinforcements from reaching Australian ports. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto represented a fundamentally different assessment of Japan's strategic situation, though his views were not uniformly supported even within the Navy. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood that Japan's window of opportunity was rapidly closing as American industrial production accelerated beyond Japanese capacity to match. Every month of delay allowed the United States to build more ships, train more pilots, and deploy more weapons across the Pacific. Japan's only hope for achieving decisive victory lay in destroying the American Pacific Fleet completely before it could recover from Pearl Harbor's devastation. The Doolittle raid had demonstrated Yamamoto's concerns with shocking clarity. If American carriers could launch bombers against Tokyo from 600 miles at sea, they could strike anywhere in the Japanese Empire. No amount of territorial expansion could protect Japan's home islands from carrier-based attacks launched from unexpected directions. The only solution was to eliminate American naval aviation entirely through decisive battle that would sink every carrier in the Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto proposed a massive operation against Midway Atoll, the westernmost American base in the Hawaiian chain. Midway was far enough from Pearl Harbor to limit land-based air support, but important enough that America would have to defend it with every available carrier. Japanese forces would seize the atoll while simultaneously destroying the American fleet in what Yamamoto envisioned as the greatest naval battle since Trafalgar. With American carriers eliminated, Japan could consolidate its empire without fear of interference and negotiate peace from a position of absolute strength. The debate between these competing strategies reflected deeper institutional tensions within Japanese military culture that had existed since the Meiji Restoration. Army leaders generally supported continued territorial expansion because it justified their large ground forces and promised new resources to exploit. Navy commanders were divided between those who wanted to secure existing conquests through defensive operations and those who believed that offensive action remained the key to victory. Political leaders in Tokyo worried about overextension but feared appearing weak before the emperor and the increasingly militant Japanese public. For weeks, the argument raged through conference rooms in Tokyo while Japanese forces consolidated their positions across the Pacific. Staff officers prepared detailed plans for multiple operations, calculating logistics requirements and analyzing potential American responses. But time was running short. The optimal weather window for major naval operations in the Central Pacific lasted only from May through July. Every day of delay reduced Japan's chances of achieving decisive victory before American reinforcements fundamentally altered the balance of power. The Doolittle raid influenced Japanese decision-making by demonstrating that homeland defense could no longer be taken for granted. Prime Minister Tojo and military leaders around Emperor Hirohito found themselves balancing the competing demands of expansion and security in ways that satisfied neither requirement completely. Rather than settling the strategic debate decisively, the bombing of Tokyo created pressure to pursue both defensive and offensive operations simultaneously. By the time Japanese leadership reached consensus, forces were already committed to Operation Mo, the advance toward Port Moresby and Tulagi. Imperial headquarters decided to proceed with both campaigns, dividing Japanese naval strength at the worst possible moment. Port Moresby's strategic importance extended far beyond its immediate military value as a naval base and airfield. The New Guinea port controlled the approaches to northern Australia and served as a forward base for Allied reconnaissance flights that monitored Japanese shipping movements. If Japanese forces captured Port Moresby, they could establish air bases within bombing range of Australian cities and shipping lanes, effectively cutting the supply line between the United States and Australia. More importantly, Japanese aircraft based at Port Moresby could intercept any American attempt to advance northward through New Guinea toward the Philippines. The base was essentially a cork in the bottle of Allied expansion, and whoever controlled it would dominate the Southwest Pacific. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the Fourth Fleet, received orders to execute Operation Mo with 3 separate invasion forces, coordinating across hundreds of miles of ocean. The smallest force would seize Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, establishing a seaplane base for reconnaissance operations. A larger amphibious force would capture Port Moresby through direct assault, supported by land-based aircraft flying from the major Japanese base at Rabaul. Most importantly, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi's carrier striking force would provide air cover for both operations while eliminating any Allied naval forces that attempted to interfere. Operation Mo appeared flawless on paper, but Japanese planners had made a critical error in their communication security procedures that would prove fatal to the mission's success. Signal traffic coordinating the complex multi-force operation had been transmitted using naval codes that American cryptanalysts had been working to break since before Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort's Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor had achieved partial success in reading portions of Japanese naval communications, and Operation Mo's extensive radio traffic provided breakthrough opportunities they needed. By late April 1942, Rochefort's team was reading significant portions of Japanese naval messages, though their intelligence picture remained incomplete and required careful interpretation. They could identify general movement patterns, unit designations, and operational timeframes, but many critical details remained hidden. Nevertheless, the intelligence they gathered allowed them to predict that Japanese forces would move against Port Moresby in early May with substantial naval support. Admiral Nimitz received intelligence reports that enabled him to position American forces more effectively than had been possible since the war began. The intelligence breakthrough came at a critical moment for Allied strategy in the Pacific Theatre. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin had been demanding additional American support to defend his country against the growing threat of Japanese invasion. General Douglas MacArthur, now commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific from Australia, insisted that Japanese expansion had to be stopped before it reached Australian territory. The Royal Australian Navy had already suffered devastating losses in the Java Sea battles, and Australian military leaders feared their country could not withstand a major Japanese assault without immediate American assistance. Nimitz faced a complex strategic calculation about how many forces to commit to defending Port Moresby versus preserving strength for future operations. His carrier strength remained critically limited. Saratoga was undergoing repairs on the west coast following torpedo damage, leaving only Enterprise, Yorktown, and Lexington available for operations across the entire Pacific Theatre. Intelligence reports suggested that Yamamoto was planning a major operation against Midway Atoll in early June, requiring Nimitz to keep substantial forces in reserve. But if Japanese forces captured Port Moresby, they would threaten Australia directly and establish bases for further expansion. Nimitz's solution was to commit just enough force to disrupt Operation Mo without fatally weakening American defenses elsewhere. Task Force 17, built around USS Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, would operate in the Coral Sea to intercept Japanese invasion forces. Task Force 11, centered on USS Lexington under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, would provide additional carrier support while maintaining operational flexibility. Combined, the two task forces could match Japanese carrier strength in the area while preserving Enterprise for the anticipated Midway operation. Weather in the Coral Sea during early May presented extraordinary challenges for naval operations. Violent tropical storms alternated with periods of oppressive heat and humidity that made flight operations dangerous for both pilots and deck crews. Navigation was complicated by coral reefs that could sink unwary ships and constant rain squalls that reduced visibility to zero without warning. The stage was set for the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval history, fought between opponents who were largely improvising tactics for a completely new form of warfare. The weather gods seemed determined to make the Battle of the Coral Sea as confusing and dangerous as possible for both combatants. Towering thunderstorms rose 40,000 feet above the ocean surface, creating walls of turbulence that grounded aircraft for hours at a time. When the storms passed, tropical heat turned ships' decks into furnaces, while humidity fogged aircraft instruments and corroded delicate electronic equipment. Constant rain squalls reduced visibility to a few hundred yards without warning, making it impossible for ships to maintain visual contact. Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 17 had been operating in these brutal conditions for over a week, refueling from tankers and maintaining strict radio silence while waiting for Japanese forces to appear. Yorktown's crew had grown accustomed to the exhausting routine of launching reconnaissance flights that returned with reports of empty ocean stretching to the horizon. But intelligence intercepts indicated that Japanese invasion forces were approaching the Coral Sea from multiple directions, and the decisive encounter could begin at any moment. The tactical challenges of carrier warfare in the Coral Sea were unlike anything either navy had faced in previous operations. Aircraft carriers were simultaneously the most powerful and most vulnerable warships ever built, capable of projecting devastating force across hundreds of miles, but virtually defenseless when caught by enemy aircraft. Success would depend on finding the enemy first while avoiding detection, then launching coordinated strikes before the opponent could respond. A single mistake in reconnaissance, timing, or navigation could result in catastrophic losses that would determine the outcome of the entire campaign. On May 3, 1942, the strategic situation changed dramatically when intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces had successfully landed at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Fletcher immediately altered course northward, steaming through the night to launch a surprise attack on the Japanese beachhead at maximum range. The opportunity was too valuable to miss. Japanese forces would be concentrated in a small area, unloading supplies and establishing defensive positions, making them vulnerable to carrier aircraft. But the attack would also reveal American carrier presence in the Coral Sea to Japanese commanders. Yorktown launched her attack at dawn on May 4th, sending multiple waves of aircraft toward Tulagi through challenging weather conditions. The Japanese garrison was caught largely unprepared for carrier-based attacks, having concentrated on establishing seaplane facilities rather than defending against air raids. American dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked Japanese shipping in Tulagi Harbor, sinking several vessels and destroying seaplanes and shore installations. More importantly, the attack revealed American carrier presence in the area to Japanese commanders, who immediately began hunting for the attacking ships. Admiral Takagi's carrier striking force, built around the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, immediately began searching for American task forces after learning of the Tulagi attack. Both sides now knew that enemy carriers were operating in the same general area, but neither had precise information about their opponent's location, strength, or intentions. The stage was set for a deadly game of hide-and-seek, played across thousands of square miles of ocean, with both sides sending out reconnaissance aircraft while attempting to remain hidden themselves. Search patterns became matters of life and death, as both sides attempted to gain the first crucial advantage of locating enemy carriers. American pilots flew methodical grid searches, covering assigned sectors with mathematical precision, but sometimes missing Japanese ships by mere miles due to weather or navigation errors. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft used different search patterns that sometimes overlapped American sectors, creating opportunities for mutual detection that neither side fully exploited due to communication failures and weather interference. Both sides experienced the frustration of pilots reporting large ships that turned out to be clouds or missing entire task forces hidden in rain squalls. Communication failures multiplied the confusion as radio signals bounced unreliably off the ionosphere or were blocked entirely by massive thunderstorms. Pilots returning from reconnaissance missions sometimes couldn't find their own carriers in the weather, forcing them to land on any available flight deck or ditch in the ocean when their fuel ran out. Task force commanders made critical decisions based on incomplete or outdated information, never certain whether their orders would reach subordinate units or whether reported enemy positions were accurate. On May 7th, both sides achieved partial contact with enemy forces, leading to confused engagements that demonstrated how difficult carrier warfare could be under real combat conditions. American pilots attacked what they believed was a major Japanese carrier task force, only to discover they had bombed the light carrier Shoho and some destroyers rather than the main enemy fleet. Japanese aircraft struck American vessels they thought were fleet carriers, sinking the oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims, but missing the precious fleet carriers they desperately needed to eliminate. Both sides claimed tactical victories, while privately worrying that they had revealed their positions without achieving decisive results. Weather conditions and similar ship silhouettes made identification extremely difficult, leading to several incidents that highlighted how easily fatal mistakes could be made in the heat of battle. These confusion incidents demonstrated that carrier warfare required new recognition techniques and communication procedures that neither navy had fully developed. The learning curve was steep, and mistakes could be catastrophic for individual pilots and entire operations. Admiral Fitch's Task Force 11, built around Lexington, had been operating independently but coordinating with Fletcher's Yorktown force through intermittent radio communications. As May 8th dawned with somewhat clearer weather, both American task forces maneuvered to concentrate their air power for what they hoped would be a decisive strike against the Japanese carrier force. Intelligence reports suggested that at least 2 Japanese fleet carriers were operating in the vicinity, presenting the opportunity for a major victory if American attacks could be properly coordinated. But the Japanese were planning exactly the same type of coordinated strike against American carriers they had finally located. The morning of May 8, 1942, would see the first time in naval history that opposing aircraft carrier forces launched simultaneous attacks against each other across hundreds of miles of ocean. The lessons learned in the next few hours would reshape naval warfare for the remainder of World War II and establish principles of carrier operations that would dominate naval thinking for decades to come. But first, both sides would pay a terrible price for their education in the realities of modern naval warfare. At approximately 11:15 a.m. on May 8, 1942, USS Lexington began what would become her final battle. The carrier, known affectionately to her crew as Lady Lex, was steaming in formation with Yorktown when Japanese dive bombers appeared through broken clouds at 14,000 feet altitude. For the next several hours, she would demonstrate both the incredible resilience of American naval engineering and the terrible vulnerability of aircraft carriers under determined enemy attack. The Japanese strike force approaching the American carriers represented some of the finest naval aviation in the world at that time. Experienced pilots who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and the conquest of the Dutch East Indies flew with the coordinated precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. They understood carrier operations better than any aviators in history and were attacking with tactical sophistication developed through months of combat experience. The strike included both dive bombers and torpedo planes, attacking from different directions to overwhelm American defenses. Lexington's combat air patrol of Wildcat fighters rose to meet the incoming attack, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by escorting Zero fighters whose performance capabilities exceeded American aircraft in several critical areas. American pilots fought desperately to break up the attack formations, but Japanese discipline and tactical coordination held firm as bombers approached their targets. Anti-aircraft guns across the task force opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of flak that forced Japanese pilots to weave through a deadly maze of explosions. But the attackers pressed home their assault with the dedication that characterized Japanese naval aviation at its peak. Captain Frederick Sherman, commanding Lexington, began evasive maneuvers as soon as Japanese aircraft appeared on radar screens. The massive carrier, displacing over 36,000 tons, responded to her helm with surprising agility as Sherman attempted to evade torpedo attacks while maintaining enough speed to continue flight operations. The carrier's size and momentum made rapid course changes difficult, but Sherman's seamanship enabled Lexington to avoid several torpedo attacks through skillful maneuvering. However, the coordinated nature of the Japanese assault made complete evasion impossible. The first torpedo struck Lexington's port side at approximately 11:20 a.m. The massive explosion lifting the carrier's bow several feet out of the water and sending shock waves throughout the ship. Seconds later, a second torpedo hit further aft, flooding engine rooms and causing the ship to develop a noticeable list to port that threatened her stability. Damage control parties rushed to seal compartments and counter-flood ballast tanks, but the torpedo damage was severe enough to reduce Lexington's speed and hamper her ability to launch aircraft effectively. Captain Sherman continued evasive maneuvers despite the damage, knowing that additional hits could prove fatal. Simultaneously with the torpedo attacks, Japanese dive bombers rolled over into steep attack runs, despite intense anti-aircraft fire from the carrier and her escorts. Lexington's 5-inch guns and smaller caliber weapons created a defensive barrage that claimed several Japanese aircraft, but others penetrated the fire to release their bombs with deadly accuracy. A 1,000-pound bomb struck near Lexington's island superstructure, destroying radar equipment and communications gear. Another bomb hit the flight deck forward, blasting a hole large enough to drive a truck through and setting aviation gasoline fires that spread rapidly despite immediate firefighting efforts. The immediate damage seemed manageable despite the torpedo and bomb hits that had struck the carrier. Lexington's damage control organization, trained to a level of excellence that rivaled any navy in the world, began the methodical process of saving their ship through established procedures. Firefighting teams attacked blazes with foam and water, while engineering crews worked to restore power and maintain propulsion systems. Medical personnel treated wounded sailors, while ammunition handlers moved ordnance away from fires that threatened to ignite the ship's magazines. For a brief period, it appeared that Lady Lex might survive her wounds and continue fighting. But aircraft carriers carried within their hulls the seeds of their own destruction in the form of aviation, gasoline, ammunition, and other volatile materials. Aviation gasoline vapors, leaking from ruptured fuel lines and storage tanks damaged by the torpedo hits, had accumulated in compartments throughout the ship. At approximately 12:47 p.m., an electrical spark from damaged wiring ignited these vapors in a catastrophic internal explosion that shook Lexington from stem to stern. The blast was followed by secondary explosions as fires spread to ammunition storage areas, transforming the carrier from a fighting ship into a floating inferno. Commander Herbert "Pop" Healy, Lexington's damage control officer, made desperate efforts to contain the spreading fires and explosions, using every resource available to his teams. But the internal explosions had ruptured fire mains and destroyed much of the ship's firefighting capability, while smoke filled compartments throughout the vessel. Most critically, the explosions had compromised the ship's structural integrity, opening seams that allowed flooding to spread beyond the damage control organization's ability to contain it. Despite heroic efforts by the crew, Lexington's condition continued to deteriorate as fires and flooding spread throughout the ship. Admiral Fitch, flying his flag aboard Lexington, faced the agonizing decision that no naval commander ever wants to make under any circumstances. His flagship was dying beneath his feet, consumed by fires and explosions that were beyond human ability to control despite the crew's extraordinary efforts. but approximately 2,800 men remained aboard the carrier, and their lives took precedence over any military consideration or personal attachment to the ship. At approximately 5:07 p.m., Captain Sherman gave the order that sealed Lexington's fate: prepare to abandon ship. The evacuation of Lexington became one of the most remarkable rescue operations in naval history, demonstrating the highest traditions of seamanship and courage under extreme circumstances. Despite the chaos of continuing explosions and spreading fires, the crew maintained discipline and followed established procedures for abandoning ship. Destroyers and cruisers moved alongside the burning carrier to take off survivors, their crews working with calm efficiency despite the constant danger of additional explosions. Life rafts and boats carried men away from the dying ship, while rescue vessels searched systematically for survivors in the water. The vast majority of Lexington's crew was rescued successfully, in a testament to American seamanship and training. Captain Sherman was among the last men to leave his ship, ensuring that all possible survivors had been evacuated before stepping onto a destroyer's deck for the final time. As he watched Lexington burn against the darkening sky, he later wrote that losing the ship felt like watching a close friend die. The carrier that had served with distinction since 1927 was reduced to a flaming wreck, her magazines exploding periodically as fires reached stored ammunition. American forces couldn't allow the burning hulk to fall into Japanese hands, so the destroyer Phelps received orders to sink Lady Lex with torpedo attacks. At approximately 8 p.m., Lexington's final agony ended as she rolled over and sank beneath the waters of the Coral Sea, taking with her irreplaceable aircraft, experienced aircrew, and months of training that couldn't be quickly replaced. The tactical loss was severe. American carrier strength in the Pacific had been reduced by 25% in a single day of fighting. But the strategic implications of the Battle of the Coral Sea would prove far more significant than the immediate material losses. Japanese forces had achieved a tactical victory by sinking Lexington while losing only the light carrier Shoho in the exchange. But the Port Moresby invasion force, deprived of adequate air cover after Shokaku was damaged and forced to withdraw, turned back without attempting the crucial landing operation. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion had been halted by American resistance rather than proceeding according to plan. More importantly, both Shokaku and Zuikaku would be unavailable for Yamamoto's planned attack on Midway due to battle damage and aircraft losses. The Battle of the Coral Sea had weakened Japanese carrier strength at the worst possible moment, just weeks before the decisive operation that would determine control of the Central Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the chart room of his flagship Yamato, studying the most complex naval operation ever conceived by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Spread across the table were charts covering nearly half the Pacific Ocean, from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska to the tiny coral atolls of Midway. What Yamamoto envisioned was not merely a battle, but a coordinated campaign that would eliminate American naval power forever and force the United States to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. The plan's scope was breathtaking in its ambition and complexity. 4 separate task forces would operate across over 3,000 miles of ocean, converging on their targets with split-second timing that left no margin for error. The Northern Force would attack the Aleutian Islands, seizing Attu and Kiska, while bombing Dutch Harbor to convince Americans that Japan's main thrust was toward Alaska. Meanwhile, the real objective lay 1,500 miles to the south, where Midway Atoll guarded the approaches to Hawaii. Midway itself was barely 6 miles across, a speck of coral and sand in the vast Pacific that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. But Yamamoto understood its strategic significance better than perhaps any other naval commander in the world. The atoll sat astride the main shipping route between Hawaii and Asia, serving as an early warning station and refueling base for American submarines and patrol aircraft. More importantly, Midway was close enough to Pearl Harbor that America would have to defend it with every available carrier. When those carriers arrived, Yamamoto would be waiting with one of the largest concentrations of Japanese naval power assembled to that point in the war. The Midway invasion force, commanded by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, would approach from the southwest with transports carrying 5,000 troops and all the equipment needed to establish a permanent Japanese base. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first carrier striking force would provide air cover while simultaneously attacking Midway's defenses to soften them for the invasion. But the real trap lay with Yamamoto's main body, following 300 miles behind the other forces with the massive battleships of the combined fleet, including Yamato and Nagato. When American carriers arrived to defend Midway, they would find themselves caught between Nagumo's carriers and Yamamoto's battleships in the greatest naval battle since Jutland. The Aleutian operation, championed by Admiral Osami Nagano, despite Yamamoto's reservations, would serve as both diversion and genuine strategic objective. Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosagaya's northern force would attack Dutch Harbour while simultaneously landing troops on Attu and Kiska Islands. The operations would extend Japan's defensive perimeter into the North Pacific while potentially drawing American forces away from Midway. If successful, Japanese bases in the Aleutians could threaten the American West Coast and force the U.S. Navy to divide its limited forces between multiple threatened areas. But the plan's complexity created vulnerabilities that Yamamoto himself privately acknowledged. Coordinating 4 separate task forces across thousands of miles of ocean required precise timing and perfect communication. Weather delays, mechanical failures, or navigation errors could throw off the entire operation's carefully choreographed schedule. Most critically, the forces were spread so far apart that they couldn't support each other if the Americans concentrated their strength against any single element. Yamamoto's confidence in the plan rested largely on intelligence estimates that proved catastrophically wrong. Japanese intelligence officers believed that Yorktown had been sunk in the Coral Sea battle, reducing American carrier strength to just Enterprise and Hornet. They estimated that Nimitz could deploy no more than 200 aircraft against the invasion force, while Nagumo alone carried over 250 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. With such overwhelming superiority, how could the operation possibly fail? The intelligence failure extended beyond simple ship counts to fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities and intentions. Japanese planners assumed that Nimitz would react defensively to the Aleutian attacks, sending precious carriers north to protect Alaska. They believed that American forces remaining in Hawaiian waters would be caught by surprise when Nagumo's carriers appeared off Midway. Most fatally, they assumed that American naval codes remained secure and that their own communications couldn't be intercepted and decoded by enemy cryptanalysts. Nagumo himself harbored private doubts about the operation that he dared not voice to his superiors. The veteran carrier commander who had led the Pearl Harbor attack understood the risks of operating so far from Japanese bases without adequate intelligence about enemy movements. His carriers would be required to attack land-based defenses, support the invasion force, and simultaneously engage American carriers if they appeared. The mission demanded more of his pilots and aircraft than any single force could realistically accomplish. The logistics of the operation strained Japanese naval capabilities to their breaking point. Over 200 ships would participate in the various phases, requiring fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts transported across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. Tanker availability limited the operational range of many vessels, while submarine threats made every convoy a dangerous gamble. Most critically, Japanese naval aviation had never fully recovered from the losses sustained in the Coral Sea battle just weeks earlier. Experienced pilots killed or wounded in that engagement couldn't be replaced, and new aircrew lacked the combat experience that had made Japanese carrier aviation so formidable. Weather patterns added another layer of complexity to the already challenging operation. June brought unpredictable fog banks and storm systems that could scatter formations or prevent air operations entirely. Navigation across thousands of miles of ocean required precise celestial observations that weather could make impossible for days at a time. Radio silence, essential for operational security, meant that scattered formations might not be able to coordinate their movements if separated by storms. Personnel fatigue became a growing concern as the operation's complexity demanded round-the-clock preparation and planning. Staff officers worked 18-hour days, calculating fuel consumption, ammunition requirements, and coordination schedules. Ship crews drilled endlessly on damage control and combat procedures, while aircraft maintenance teams struggled to keep aging planes airworthy. The strain of sustaining such intensive preparation over weeks of approach time began to show in decreased efficiency and increased error rates across all levels of the fleet. Most ominously, Japanese radio intercept capabilities had detected increasing American naval activity around Hawaii and the West Coast. Intelligence analysts couldn't determine whether this represented normal defensive preparations or specific knowledge of Japanese intentions. The possibility that Americans might be preparing for the attack created uncertainty about enemy dispositions and capabilities. But by late May, the massive Japanese fleet was already committed to the operation, and turning back would represent an unacceptable loss of face for the Imperial Navy. As May turned to June 1942, the massive Japanese armada began its approach toward what Yamamoto believed would be the decisive battle of the Pacific War. Radio silence was strictly maintained to preserve operational security, while scout submarines deployed ahead of the main forces to provide early warning of American movements. Weather reports indicated favorable conditions for the planned attacks, and morale among Japanese crews remained high despite the challenging mission ahead. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan, but Yamamoto couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ocean seemed too quiet, and American naval activity too limited for forces preparing to defend such a strategically important target. Unknown to Yamamoto, every aspect of his carefully guarded plan was already known to his enemies. In basement offices beneath Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had achieved the intelligence breakthrough that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The battle for Midway would be won or lost not by superior seamanship or tactical brilliance, but by the patient work of code breakers who had penetrated Japan's most secret communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort emerged from his basement office at Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942, carrying the most important intelligence report in American naval history. For weeks, his combat intelligence unit had been working around the clock to break Japanese naval codes, and their breakthrough couldn't have come at a more critical moment. The decrypt in Rochefort's hands contained the complete Japanese operational plan for what they called Operation Me, the assault on Midway Atoll. The intelligence coup was the result of months of painstaking cryptanalytic work that had accelerated dramatically after the Coral Sea battle. Japanese confidence in their communication security had led to increasingly detailed radio traffic about the upcoming operation. Rochefort's team, working with British cryptanalysts and using captured Japanese codebooks, had gradually assembled enough pieces of the puzzle to reconstruct Yamamoto's entire plan. They knew the target, the timing, the forces involved, and most importantly, the Japanese assumption that Yorktown had been sunk. To confirm their intelligence, Rochefort's team devised an ingenious test that proved the accuracy of their code-breaking efforts. They instructed Midway's garrison to send an uncoded radio message reporting problems with their water purification system. Within days, Japanese intelligence broadcasts reported that AF, their code designation for Midway, was experiencing fresh water shortages. The confirmation eliminated any doubt that American cryptanalysts were reading Japanese naval communications accurately and completely. Admiral Nimitz received Rochefort's intelligence report with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces would enter battle with superior knowledge of enemy plans and dispositions. But the intelligence also revealed the overwhelming size of the Japanese force approaching Midway. Yamamoto was committing nearly every major warship in the Imperial Navy to the operation, including all 4 of Japan's remaining fleet carriers and the powerful battleships of the combined fleet. American forces would be outnumbered by margins that made victory seem impossible through conventional tactics. The intelligence advantage would only matter if Nimitz could concentrate sufficient force to exploit it effectively. Enterprise and Hornet were already at Pearl Harbor, but Yorktown remained at sea following her damage in the Coral Sea battle. Preliminary damage assessments suggested that repairing the carrier would require months in a mainland shipyard, but Nimitz couldn't afford to fight the crucial battle with only 2 carriers against 4. He made the desperate decision to attempt repairs at Pearl Harbor that would normally be considered impossible under field conditions. Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, with her flight deck scarred by bomb damage and her hull showing obvious signs of structural stress. Navy repair crews swarmed aboard the carrier even before she was properly moored, beginning work that would continue around the clock for the next 3 days. Civilian contractors worked alongside military personnel, welding steel plates over bomb holes and replacing damaged electrical systems, while the ship's crew loaded ammunition and aviation fuel. What should have taken 3 months was compressed into 72 hours through sheer determination and exceptional seamanship. The repair effort became a symbol of American industrial capability and determination that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. Welders worked in shifts around the clock, using portable equipment to patch holes in the flight deck, while structural engineers reinforced damaged internal compartments. Electronics technicians replaced radar and communication equipment destroyed in the Coral Sea battle, while ordnance specialists loaded the ship with every available bomb and torpedo. By May 30th, Yorktown was declared ready for combat operations, though her repairs remained largely cosmetic and her structural integrity remained questionable. Nimitz's preparations extended beyond ship repairs to include every aspect of the coming battle. Midway's garrison was reinforced with additional anti-aircraft guns, Marine fighter squadrons, and Army B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. Submarine patrols were positioned to intercept Japanese forces and provide early warning of their approach. Most importantly, Nimitz issued detailed battle plans based on his complete knowledge of Japanese intentions and timing. American task forces would position themselves northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, but close enough to launch coordinated strikes when Nagumo's carriers appeared. The psychological preparation of American crews proved as important as the material preparations. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American naval personnel entered battle confident that they possessed crucial advantages over their opponents. The intelligence breakthrough had revealed Japanese plans completely, while rapid repairs had restored American carrier strength to 3 ships against the expected 4 enemy carriers. More importantly, the battle would be fought close to American bases, allowing damaged ships to retreat to Pearl Harbor for repairs, while Japanese forces operated at the extreme limit of their range. Hollywood director John Ford arrived at Pearl Harbor on May 29th with a small camera crew and orders from the Navy Department to film the upcoming battle. Ford's presence reflected the strategic importance that Washington placed on the Midway operation and the need to document what might be America's most crucial naval victory. The famous filmmaker would position himself on Midway during the battle, capturing footage that would become some of the most dramatic combat film of the entire war. His cameras would record not just the battle itself, but the courage and determination of American forces fighting against overwhelming odds. As June began, American preparations reached their climax with the departure of Task Forces 16 and 17 from Pearl Harbor. Enterprise and Hornet sailed first, followed by the hastily repaired Yorktown, whose structural integrity remained uncertain. Admiral Fletcher commanded the overall operation from Yorktown, while Admiral Spruance led Enterprise and Hornet in their first major combat operation under his command. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War, and for the first time since December 7th, American forces held the crucial advantage of surprise. June 4th, 1942, dawned clear and calm over Midway Atoll as Admiral Nagumo's first carrier striking force approached from the northwest. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Japanese aircrew completed their final preparations for what they expected to be another routine attack against an American base. The target appeared lightly defended. Intelligence reports suggested minimal American naval forces in the area, and Japanese pilot morale remained high despite the early morning launch time. Everything seemed to favor another devastating Japanese victory that would bring the Pacific War closer to its inevitable conclusion. At approximately 6 a.m., Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway with 108 aircraft, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 36 torpedo planes loaded with bombs for ground attack. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation as it climbed into the morning sky, his pilots confident in their ability to neutralize American defenses and prepare the way for the invasion force that followed behind. The strike represented half of Nagumo's available aircraft, with the remaining planes held in reserve, armed for potential naval combat if American ships appeared unexpectedly. The division of forces reflected standard Japanese doctrine, but it would prove fatal when American carriers struck back. Marine Fighter Squadron 221 scrambled from Midway's airfield as radar detected the incoming Japanese formation at 65 miles distance. Major Floyd Parks led 25 Wildcat and Buffalo fighters into the air to intercept the attackers, knowing that his obsolete aircraft were no match for Japanese Zeros in aerial combat. The Marine pilots climbed desperately toward the approaching enemy, understanding that they were flying to almost certain death, but determined to inflict maximum damage on the Japanese strike force. Their sacrifice would buy precious time for ground defenders to prepare for the assault that was coming. The aerial battle began 60 miles northwest of Midway as Marine fighters tore into the Japanese formation with desperate courage. Captain Marion Carl and Lieutenant Clayton Canfield shot down several enemy aircraft before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and performance. 15 Marine fighters were shot down in the first few minutes of combat, but their attack had disrupted Japanese formation integrity and warned ground defenders of the approaching strike. The surviving Japanese aircraft pressed toward their target, but Tomonaga's carefully planned attack had already been thrown off schedule by the fierce Marine resistance. Anti-aircraft gunners on Midway opened fire as Japanese dive bombers appeared overhead at 7 a.m. sharp. Marine gun crews, reinforced by Navy personnel and Army air defense specialists, sent up a barrage of flak that filled the sky with black smoke and deadly shrapnel. The anti-aircraft fire was heavier and more accurate than Japanese pilots expected, forcing them to attack from higher altitude and reducing their bombing accuracy significantly. Several Japanese aircraft were shot down by the defensive fire, though most pressed through to complete their attacks. Japanese bombs fell across Midway's 2 small islands, destroying buildings, fuel storage tanks, and communication equipment. The power plant was hit and knocked offline, while several aircraft hangars were destroyed by direct hits that killed ground personnel and destroyed parked aircraft. But the most critical targets, the runways and fuel storage areas, remained largely intact despite the sustained bombing attack. American defensive preparations had included dispersing vital facilities and hardening key installations against air attack. The damage was significant but not decisive, and Midway remained capable of launching and recovering aircraft. Lieutenant Tomonaga, leading the Japanese strike, radioed back to Nagumo at approximately 7:05 a.m. with a message that would prove crucial to the day's outcome. Reports indicate he signaled that there was need for a second attack. Midway's defences had proven stronger than expected, and the airfield remained operational despite the bombing. A follow-up strike would be necessary to neutralise the base completely before the invasion force could safely approach the atoll. The message forced Nagumo to make a decision that would determine the fate of his entire fleet. Unknown to Nagumo, American scout planes from Midway had already spotted his carrier force and radioed its position back to the defenders. At approximately 7 a.m., reconnaissance aircraft sent electrifying messages reporting multiple ships bearing northwest of Midway. Minutes later, another scout reported the sighting that would change everything: carriers and main body ships spotted northwest of the atoll. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was located and were prepared to strike back immediately. As Japanese bombs exploded across Midway, every available American aircraft on the atoll was already launching to attack Nagumo's carriers before they could recover their striking force. The counterattack would be desperate and uncoordinated, but it represented America's first opportunity to strike back at the heart of Japanese naval power. The Battle of Midway had begun, and neither side yet understood that the next few hours would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The first American counterattack against Nagumo's carriers began at approximately 7 to 10 a.m., when 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers lifted off from Midway's damaged runway. Lieutenant Langdon Feebling led the brand-new aircraft toward the Japanese fleet, followed by 4 Army B-26 Marauder bombers, attempting their first and only torpedo attack of the war. These crews were flying obsolete tactics with inadequate aircraft against the most experienced naval aviators in the world, but they represented America's only immediate response to the Japanese assault. The torpedo attacks that followed revealed the deadly reality of naval aviation combat that no amount of training could fully prepare airmen to face. Japanese Zero fighters swarmed the slow-moving American torpedo planes, shooting them down one by one as they struggled to reach attack position. Feebling's Avenger was hit repeatedly, but continued toward the carrier Akagi until cannon fire killed the pilot and sent the aircraft spiraling into the ocean. Of the 6 Avengers that attacked, only one returned to Midway, its gunner dead and its pilot wounded. The Army B-26 attack proved equally devastating for the attackers. Captain James Collins led his 4 bombers in a low-level approach toward the Japanese carriers, flying at mast height to avoid anti-aircraft fire while Zero fighters dove on them from above. 2 Marauders were shot down immediately, while Collins's aircraft was so badly damaged that it barely made it back to Midway with its hydraulic system destroyed and multiple crew members wounded. The 4th bomber, piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, scored near misses on a Japanese carrier but caused no significant damage. At approximately 8 to 10 a.m., 16 Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Major Lofton Henderson, took off from Midway for what would become known as the Squadron of Doom. Henderson's pilots were experienced in dive bombing techniques, but they had never attacked moving ships defended by fighter aircraft and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. As they approached the Japanese fleet, Zero fighters intercepted them with devastating effectiveness, shooting down Henderson himself along with 7 other aircraft. The surviving Marines pressed their attacks but achieved only near misses that caused no significant damage to Japanese carriers. The final Midway-based attack came from 15 Army B-17 Flying Fortress bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney. The heavy bombers attacked from 20,000 feet, well above the effective range of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, but high-altitude bombing against moving ships proved completely ineffective. Despite dropping dozens of bombs and claiming multiple hits, the B-17s caused no damage to Japanese ships whatsoever. The attack demonstrated the limitations of strategic bombers against naval targets and consumed precious time that the Japanese used to reorganize their forces. By 9 a.m., all of Midway's aircraft had been committed to attacking the Japanese fleet, and the results were catastrophic for American forces. Over half the attacking aircraft had been shot down, with minimal damage inflicted on their targets. Japanese carrier defenses had proven overwhelmingly effective against uncoordinated attacks by individual squadrons flying different aircraft types with inadequate fighter escort. But the persistent American attacks had achieved something far more important than physical damage. They had kept Japanese carriers busy defending themselves instead of preparing for follow-up strikes against Midway. More critically, the attacks had convinced Admiral Nagumo that a second strike against Midway was absolutely necessary. At approximately 7:15 a.m., even before the American attacks began, Nagumo had ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with bombs for ground attack instead of the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs they carried for naval combat. The decision meant that when American carriers finally appeared, half of Nagumo's strike force would be armed with the wrong weapons and unavailable for immediate launch. The persistent attacks by Midway-based aircraft had disrupted Japanese planning and timing at the worst possible moment for the Imperial Navy. As the last American aircraft from Midway withdrew from the target area, Nagumo's carriers began recovering the strike force that had attacked the atoll. Japanese pilots reported successful attacks against American installations, but noted that the runways remained operational and that a second strike would be required. Flight deck crews began the complex process of refueling and rearming aircraft while maintaining readiness for immediate launch if American naval forces appeared. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan, but the most dangerous phase of the battle was about to begin. At approximately 9:20 a.m., Admiral Nagumo received a radio message that would seal the fate of his fleet. A scout plane reported ships bearing northeast of Midway at significant distance. The report confirmed Japanese worst fears. American carriers were operating in the area and were already within striking range of the Japanese fleet. The carefully planned operation had become a deadly race against time, with both sides struggling to launch coordinated strikes before their opponents could attack first. The Battle of Midway was about to enter its decisive phase, and the advantage lay with whoever could get their aircraft airborne first. At approximately 9:25 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Torpedo Squadron 8 began its approach toward the Japanese carrier force that would make its members legends in American naval aviation. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet in what he knew would be a one-way mission against overwhelming odds. The Devastators were obsolete aircraft, slow and vulnerable, carrying torpedoes that often failed to explode even when they hit their targets. But Waldron's pilots flew toward the Japanese fleet with the courage and determination that would define American naval aviation at its finest hour. The torpedo attack that followed became one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval warfare history. As Waldron's formation approached the Japanese carriers, dozens of Zero fighters swarmed down from above, while anti-aircraft fire from every ship in the fleet filled the sky with deadly shrapnel. The slow-moving Devastators, loaded with heavy torpedoes and flying at low altitude, were sitting ducks for the Japanese defenders, who attacked with methodical precision. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down until only Waldron's aircraft remained, and then it too disappeared in a ball of fire and smoke. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the ocean just a few hundred yards from the Japanese fleet and watched the destruction of his entire squadron. Gay had been shot down during his attack run, but survived the crash landing and remained hidden among floating debris while Japanese ships maneuvered around him. From his position in the water, he witnessed the systematic annihilation of American torpedo attacks that claimed the lives of some of the finest aviators in the Navy. The courage of these men, flying to certain death against impossible odds, would inspire generations of naval aviators who followed. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived at the Japanese fleet just as Waldron's last aircraft was being shot down. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 Devastators in another low-level attack that met the same fate as the first. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 10 of Lindsay's aircraft, including his own, while the 4 survivors limped back toward their carrier with no hits scored against Japanese ships. The torpedo attacks seemed to be accomplishing nothing except the wholesale slaughter of American aircrew. The final torpedo attack came from Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 12 Devastators approached the Japanese fleet from a different direction, hoping to catch the defenders off guard and coordinate with dive bombers that were supposed to attack simultaneously. But the dive bombers had been delayed by navigation problems, leaving Massey's squadron to face the full fury of Japanese defenses alone. 10 of the 12 torpedo bombers were shot down, including Massey himself, while the 2 survivors returned to Yorktown with severe damage and no torpedo hits achieved. In less than an hour, 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese fleet, and only 6 had returned to their carriers. 35 aircrew were dead or missing, representing some of the most experienced pilots and gunners in the Pacific Fleet. No torpedoes had hit their targets, and Japanese carriers continued operating at full capability while recovering their own aircraft and preparing for counterstrikes. The attacks appeared to be a complete disaster that had accomplished nothing except the destruction of an irreplaceable component of American naval aviation. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had achieved something far more important than physical damage to Japanese ships. For over an hour, Japanese fighters had been pulled down to sea level to attack the slow-moving torpedo bombers, burning fuel and ammunition while losing altitude and formation integrity. Japanese carrier decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, making them vulnerable to attack but unable to launch immediate counterstrikes. Most critically, Japanese combat air patrol was completely out of position when American dive bombers finally arrived over the fleet. The torpedo attacks had also demonstrated the courage and determination of American naval aviation that would sustain the fleet through the difficult campaigns ahead. Pilots like John Waldron, Eugene Lindsay, and Lance Massey had flown to certain death rather than abandon their mission or their shipmates. Their sacrifice inspired the dive bomber pilots who followed and proved that American resolve remained unbroken despite the disasters of the previous 6 months. The torpedo squadrons had paid the ultimate price, but they had created the conditions that would allow American dive bombers to achieve the most decisive victory in naval aviation history. As the last surviving torpedo bombers limped away from the Japanese fleet, Admiral Nagumo's carriers began the process of reorganizing their defenses and preparing for the next phase of the battle. Japanese pilots were exhausted from the sustained combat, and their aircraft needed refueling and rearming before they could launch effective counterattacks. The persistent American attacks had disrupted Japanese timing and forced their carriers to maneuver defensively rather than offensively. Unknown to the Japanese, American dive bombers were already approaching from high altitude, and the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was about to be redeemed in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. At approximately 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet spread below him like toys on a blue carpet. McCluskey led 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in the attack that would change the course of the Pacific War. For nearly an hour, he had searched for the enemy carriers while his aircraft consumed precious fuel following hunches and instinct when radio navigation failed. Now, the entire Japanese fleet lay beneath him, their carriers crowded with aircraft and their fighters out of position at low altitude. The scene below was a dive bomber pilot's dream. 3 Japanese carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was in the center with Kaga to her left and Soryu to her right. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was several miles away and temporarily hidden by clouds, but 3 fleet carriers represented the greatest target any American pilot had ever seen. McCluskey split his formation, leading half his bombers toward Akagi, while Lieutenant Richard Best led the remainder against Kaga. The dive bomber attack began at approximately 10:24 a.m., with precision that seemed almost supernatural after hours of failed American attacks. McCluskey's Dauntlesses rolled over into 70-degree dives from 14,000 feet, their pilots aiming for the vulnerable elevators and flight decks where Japanese aircraft sat loaded with fuel and ammunition. Anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them, but the attack was so sudden and unexpected that Japanese gunners had little time to adjust their aim. The dive bombers plunged through the flak with deadly accuracy, their 1,000-pound bombs already armed and ready for impact. Lieutenant Dick Best's bomb struck Akagi's flight deck at approximately 10:26 a.m., penetrating the wooden planking and exploding in the hangar deck below. The blast ignited aviation, gasoline, and ammunition from the aircraft spotted for launch, starting fires that spread rapidly throughout the carrier. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as fuel tanks and bomb storage areas caught fire, turning Japan's premier aircraft carrier into a blazing inferno within minutes. Admiral Nagumo, standing on Akagi's bridge, watched in horror as his flagship was transformed from the pride of the Imperial Navy into a floating funeral pyre. Simultaneously, McCluskey's other dive bombers were attacking the carrier Kaga with devastating effectiveness. 4 bombs hit the carrier in rapid succession, blasting holes in her flight deck and starting fires that quickly spread out of control. The bombs penetrated to the hangar deck, where they detonated among stored aircraft and fuel supplies. Within minutes, Kaga was burning as fiercely as her sister ship, her damage control parties overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. At almost the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 dive bombers from Yorktown against the carrier Soryu in a perfectly coordinated attack. Leslie's own bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned during the dive, but his pilots achieved multiple hits that sealed Soryu's fate within minutes. The bombs struck the carrier's flight deck and penetrated to the hangar below, starting fires that spread rapidly through the ship. Soryu began listing immediately, as damage control efforts failed to contain the spreading fires and explosions that consumed the vessel. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been mortally wounded by American dive bombers, operating with precision that bordered on the miraculous. The timing and coordination of the attacks had been perfect, catching Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment with aircraft spotted for launch and minimal fighter protection overhead. Months of training and preparation had culminated in these few minutes of devastating attack that eliminated Japanese naval aviation supremacy in the Pacific. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. Their attacks had created the conditions that allowed the dive bombers to achieve total surprise. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, watched the destruction of his fleet with stunned disbelief. In 5 minutes, the combined fleet had lost 3/4 of its carrier strength and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and aircrew. The carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were now burning wrecks that would never fight again. The plan to eliminate American naval power had backfired catastrophically, eliminating Japanese naval power instead. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained undamaged and immediately began preparing counterstrikes against the American fleet. But the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently in favor of the United States. Japan's naval aviation had been crippled beyond repair, while American industrial capacity would replace the losses sustained at Midway within months. The 5 minutes from approximately 10:24 to 10:29 a.m. on June 4, 1942, would be remembered as the moment when Japan lost the Pacific War. The sleeping giant had awakened completely, and its industrial might would prove unstoppable in the campaigns that followed. The victory at Midway had cost Japan 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers and the heart of its naval aviation, but the battle was far from over for the battered American fleet. USS Yorktown, her flight deck patched with steel plates and her hull bearing the scars of Coral Sea, had performed magnificently during the crucial dive bomber attacks. But the hastily repaired carrier's luck was about to run out in the most tragic way possible, just as victory seemed assured. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft from the surviving carrier Hiryu had struck back at the American fleet, hitting Yorktown with bombs that started fires and caused severe flooding. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had ordered the ship abandoned that afternoon, but damage control efforts proved so successful that salvage operations were planned. Yorktown seemed to have survived her second major battle in as many months, defying every prediction about her seaworthiness after the hasty Pearl Harbor repairs. 2 days later, on June 6th, Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, spotted the crippled carrier being tended by salvage crews. Tanabe had been stalking American forces, desperately seeking an opportunity to strike back after watching his nation's carrier fleet burn on the horizon. The submarine was one of Japan's most advanced boats, and as Yorktown lay dead in the water with minimal escort, she presented exactly the kind of target that submarine commanders dreamed of finding. The destroyer, USS Hammond, had come alongside Yorktown to provide electrical power and assist with damage control operations. Hundreds of sailors were working frantically to save their ship, pumping out flooded compartments and fighting fires that continued to smolder in her hull. The scene represented everything admirable about American seamanship: men risking their lives to save their ship and shipmates, refusing to give up despite overwhelming damage. But their courage also made them perfect targets for Tanabe's waiting submarine. At 1:30 p.m. on June 6th, I-168 fired a spread of 4 Type 95 torpedoes at the 2 American ships from 1,200 yards range. The weapons ran true and straight, their warheads set to detonate beneath the target hulls for maximum destructive effect. Lookouts aboard Yorktown spotted the torpedo wakes racing toward them, but the carrier was dead in the water and unable to maneuver. Hammond attempted to get underway, but there wasn't enough time to avoid the deadly spread of weapons. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her starboard side, the massive explosions lifting the 32,000-ton carrier several feet out of the water. The blasts opened huge holes in her hull and caused catastrophic flooding that overwhelmed the damage control teams. But the most tragic loss came when a 3rd torpedo struck Hammond directly amidships, breaking the destroyer's back and killing over 80 sailors instantly. The gallant destroyer that had come to help Yorktown became a victim of the same attack, sinking within minutes. The explosion that destroyed Hammond also damaged Yorktown's hull through underwater shockwaves that opened additional seams to the sea. Water poured into the carrier faster than her pumps could handle, causing a severe list that made further damage control efforts nearly impossible. Captain Buckmaster, who had returned to his ship with volunteer crews to attempt repairs, now faced the agonizing decision to abandon Yorktown for the final time. The carrier that had fought so bravely at Coral Sea and Midway was finally succumbing to her accumulated wounds. Throughout the night of June 6th and into the morning of June 7th, Yorktown fought her final battle against the inexorable forces of physics and the sea. Salvage teams worked desperately to reduce her list and keep her afloat, but the submarine attack had inflicted damage that no amount of seamanship could overcome. The carrier's list increased steadily as water found its way into compartments that had been sealed since the Coral Sea battle. Emergency pumps and portable generators proved futile against the massive flooding caused by multiple torpedo hits. At dawn, on June 7th, photographers aboard nearby destroyers captured the final images of USS Yorktown as she rolled over and began her descent to the ocean floor. The carrier that had been the backbone of American resistance in the Pacific sank in 16,650 feet of water, taking with her the battle flags that had flown over the Coral Sea and Midway. Her loss represented more than the destruction of a single ship. It marked the end of the desperate period when America fought with obsolete equipment and inadequate forces against a seemingly invincible enemy. But Yorktown's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her aircraft had played a crucial role in sinking 3 Japanese carriers at Midway, dealing a blow to enemy naval aviation from which it would never recover. The intelligence gathered by her reconnaissance planes had provided Admiral Nimitz with information needed to position American forces for maximum advantage. Most importantly, her crew's courage had demonstrated that American resolve remained unbroken despite 6 months of disasters and defeats. The sinking of Yorktown also marked a transition in the character of the Pacific War. The desperate battles fought with inadequate forces and obsolete equipment were giving way to campaigns where American industrial superiority would prove decisive. New carriers were already under construction in American shipyards, along with the aircraft and trained crews needed to man them. Within 6 months, the Pacific Fleet would possess more carriers than it had lost since Pearl Harbor, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace even a fraction of their Midway losses. As rescue ships searched for survivors from both Yorktown and Hammond, the strategic implications of the Midway victory were already becoming clear to commanders on both sides. Japan had lost not just 4 carriers, but the cream of its naval aviation, experienced pilots who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. American losses, while painful, represented ships and planes that could be built again within months by an industrial system just reaching its full wartime capacity. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently, though the full implications would not become apparent for many months. Yorktown's final battle had ended in defeat, but her overall contribution to American victory was immeasurable. The carrier had bought precious time for American industry to mobilize while proving that Japanese forces were not invincible. Her crews had written new chapters in naval aviation history and demonstrated the courage that would sustain American forces through the long campaigns ahead. As she disappeared beneath the Pacific waves, Yorktown carried with her the memory of desperate battles fought when America's survival hung in the balance. While the decisive battle raged at Midway, 1,500 miles to the north, another phase of Yamamoto's complex plan was unfolding with considerably more success for Japanese forces. The northern force, under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosagaya, had approached the Aleutian Islands of Alaska largely undetected, achieving the strategic surprise that had eluded Japanese forces at Midway. On June 3rd and 4th, Japanese bombers attacked the American naval base at Dutch Harbor, inflicting significant damage while demonstrating that American territory remained vulnerable to enemy assault. The attack on Dutch Harbor caught American defenders largely unprepared, despite intelligence warnings about Japanese intentions in the North Pacific. Weather conditions in the Aleutians were notoriously unpredictable, with fog banks and storms that could ground aircraft for days at a time. Japanese pilots, flying from the carriers Ryujo and Junyo, pressed their attacks through some of the worst flying conditions in the world, hitting fuel storage tanks, barracks, and aircraft facilities with devastating effectiveness. But the real strategic objective lay further west, where Japanese landing forces prepared to seize the remote islands of Attu and Kiska. These barren mountainous islands seemed to offer little military value to outside observers, but Japanese planners understood their potential significance for future operations. Bases in the Aleutians could threaten shipping lanes between the United States and the Soviet Union, while providing staging areas for potential attacks on the American West Coast. More importantly, Japanese occupation of American territory would demonstrate that the United States could not protect its own soil from enemy invasion. On June 7th, Japanese troops landed on Kiska Island, meeting no organized resistance from the small weather station personnel who had no means of defending themselves. The following day, a larger force occupied Attu Island, capturing the entire civilian population of 42 Aleut natives and 2 non-native residents. These Alaskan civilians became the only American civilians to be captured and held by enemy forces during World War II, enduring harsh conditions in Japanese prison camps that would claim several lives. The Japanese occupation of the Aleutian Islands created immediate strategic complications for American military planners already stretched thin across the Pacific. Alaska's defenses had been considered adequate against the limited threat that the territory seemed to face, but Japanese bases within bombing range of American cities demanded immediate reinforcement. Troops, aircraft, and ships had to be diverted from other theatres to defend against possible follow-up attacks from the newly established enemy bases. The psychological impact was even greater. For the first time since 1812, foreign forces occupied American soil. Weather conditions in the Aleutians created unique challenges for both occupation forces and potential liberators. The islands were shrouded in fog for much of the year, with temperatures that rarely rose above freezing and winds that could reach hurricane force without warning. Japanese troops struggled to establish defensive positions on terrain that consisted largely of volcanic rock, tundra, and swamps that froze solid in winter. Supply lines stretching back to Japan were vulnerable to submarine attack and weather delays that could leave garrison forces isolated for weeks. American reconnaissance flights revealed that Japanese forces were working frantically to build airfields and defensive installations despite the challenging conditions. Construction equipment and building materials had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean, then moved ashore on beaches that offered minimal protection from constant storms. But Japanese engineers persevered with the same determination that had built bases across the Pacific, gradually transforming the barren islands into potential staging areas for further expansion. The successful Japanese operations in the Aleutians demonstrated that despite the devastating defeat at Midway, the Imperial Navy retained significant offensive capabilities in certain areas. The Northern Force had achieved its objectives while the main fleet suffered catastrophic losses, proving that Japanese naval forces remained formidable opponents when properly concentrated and supported. This partial success would complicate American strategic planning for months to come, forcing continued division of resources between multiple threatened areas. Planning for the eventual liberation of the Aleutian Islands began immediately, but American commanders faced the same logistical nightmares that challenged Japanese occupation forces. Operating in the North Pacific required specialized equipment, cold weather training, and supply systems capable of functioning in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The distances involved were staggering, over 1,000 miles from the nearest major American base to the occupied islands, across waters patrolled by Japanese submarines and swept by storms that could sink unwary vessels. The Aleutian Campaign also revealed the global scope that the Pacific War was assuming as 1942 progressed. What had begun as a conflict between Japan and the Western powers was now involving territories from Alaska to Australia, creating a theatre of operations larger than any in human history. Success in one area did not guarantee success in others, as the simultaneous victory at Midway and defeat in the Aleutians clearly demonstrated. The war's complexity was increasing rather than decreasing, with each strategic decision creating new challenges and opportunities for both sides. As summer 1942 gave way to autumn, the full implications of the battles fought in those crucial months between April and June began to emerge. Japan's expansion had been halted but not reversed, while American industrial capacity was just beginning to reach its full potential. The sleeping giant was fully awake now, but the enemy remained dangerous and determined to defend what it had conquered. The battles ahead would be larger, bloodier, and more complex than anything yet seen in the Pacific War. But the foundation for eventual American victory had been laid in those 6 months, when desperate courage and superior intelligence had overcome seemingly impossible odds.